That was the night I called my brother. That was the night I finally understood that some families don't want a daughter-in-law. They want a servant who smiles. I was 32 when I met Brendan's family for the first time. Not his parents, not his sister, his entire extended family, all at once, at his cousin's engagement dinner in Burlington. Brendan had warned me it would be loud, that his family was a lot, and I'd laughed because I grew up in a loud family too. I thought I understood what he meant. I didn't. Brendan and I had been together for 3 years by that point. We'd met at work, both of us in project management at a mid-size construction firm in Hamilton, and we'd fallen into each other slowly, the way you do when you spend 8 hours a day solving problems alongside someone. He was steady, dependable. The kind of man who remembered that you liked oat milk but not in your coffee, only in your tea. I loved him for the small things as much as the big ones. His mother, Maureen, I had met twice before that dinner. Once at Thanksgiving at Brendan's apartment, where she'd cooked everything herself and gently rearranged every dish I'd brought. Once at a birthday lunch for Brendan's younger sister, Phoebe, where Maureen had spent the entire meal asking me questions that sounded polite but landed like tests. And your parents, they're still in Sudbury? Oh, it must be hard for them, so far from the city. That kind of thing. I told myself she was just protective. I told myself she needed time. I told myself a lot of things in those 3 years. The engagement dinner was for Brendan's cousin, a cheerful guy named Alec, and his fiancée, whom everyone adored. The venue was a private dining room at a restaurant in downtown Burlington. Exposed brick, long wooden tables, the kind of place that cost $400 a head, and acts casual about it. About 40 people, maybe more. Brendan's family took up 2/3 of the room. Maureen was at the head of one table, as she always seemed to be at family events. She had the kind of presence that reorganized a room around her without anyone noticing it had happened. She wore a cream blazer and a single strand of pearls, and she greeted me with a kiss on the cheek that didn't quite reach my skin. I sat beside Brendan. I smiled. I made conversation. I complimented the food, which was genuinely excellent. I thought the evening was going well. It wasn't. I found out later, much later, that the trouble had started weeks before the dinner, that someone had been talking to Maureen, that someone had been feeding her a particular version of events that had nothing to do with what actually happened. But I didn't know any of that yet, sitting at that long wooden table with my glass of Niagara Riesling, feeling like maybe, finally, I was starting to belong. The dinner wound down slowly, the way long family meals do. The plates were cleared. The speeches happened. Alec's father gave a long and rambling toast that made everyone laugh. Brendan squeezed my hand under the table. That's when it started. Maureen stood up. Not to give a toast, just stood up at her end of the table and looked down toward where I was sitting. She said, loudly enough for the whole room to hear, "I think we should discuss what happened with the Kellerman account." I had no idea what she was talking about. The Kellerman account was a project at Brendan's firm, not my firm, his firm, a different company entirely. I had left that company 14 months earlier for a better position. I said so, very calmly. "I haven't worked there in over a year, Maureen." She smiled, the kind of smile that isn't a smile. "Yes," she said, after the complaint. The room went quiet. I felt Brendan go still beside me. I said, and I was still calm, I was still trying, "I'm sorry, what complaint?" And Maureen said, in front of 40 people, including Alex Fiasese's entire family whom I had never met, that she had heard I'd left Brendan's former company under a cloud, that there had been a professional complaint filed against me, that she had it on good authority. The authority, I would find out later, was someone named Vincent. Brendan's old university friend, a man I had met exactly once, briefly, at a hockey game, who had apparently told Maureen that I'd been let go rather than resigned, which was completely false. I had left voluntarily for a 30% salary increase and a senior title. I had given 8 weeks' notice. My manager had written me a glowing LinkedIn recommendation that was still live on my profile. But none of that mattered in that moment, because I was standing in a private dining room in Burlington with 40 pairs of eyes on me, and the woman who was going to be my mother-in-law had just implied, in front of everyone, that I was professionally disgraced. I looked at Brendan. Brendan looked at his plate. That was the moment. Not what Maureen said, not the 40 people watching. The moment was Brendan looking at his plate. I excused myself from the table. I walked to the coat check at the front of the restaurant, retrieved my jacket, and I stepped outside into the November cold. The street was quiet. There was that particular still that comes right before snow, the air heavy and waiting. I called my brother Scott. Scott is 3 years older than me. He is an accountant in Ottawa, calm to the point where people sometimes mistake it for detachment. He is the person I call when I need to think clearly, and I am too close to a situation to do it myself. He answered on the second ring. I said, "I need you to help me figure out what just happened." He listened. I told him everything: the dinner, Maureen's speech, Brendan's silence, Vincent, and whatever he had said. When I finished, Scott was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "Okay, what do you want to do?" I said I didn't know yet. He said, "Do you want me to come?" I said, "Not yet." I went back inside. I sat back down beside Brendan. The table had recovered. Conversation had restarted. Dessert had been brought out. The moment was being collectively smoothed over the way family moments often are. Maureen was talking to someone at the other end of the table, as if nothing had happened. Brendan leaned toward me and said quietly, "She didn't mean anything by it." I said, "She accused me of professional misconduct in front of your entire family and strangers." He said, "She was just asking." I put my fork down. Brendan and I had been together 3 years. 3 years of his birthdays and my birthdays, of weekends at his place in Hamilton and mine in Oakville, of meeting each other's parents and being careful with each other's soft spots. 3 years of me telling myself that his relationship with his mother was complicated and that I needed to be patient. But in that moment, I realized something very clearly. The person who needed to be patient had always been me. The person who had been careful had always been me, and the person expected to absorb whatever happened, to smile and say, "She didn't mean anything," had always been me. I said, "I need you to say something to her. Tonight, in front of some of those people." He said, "I don't want to cause a scene." I said, "She caused a scene." He said nothing. I picked up my fork. I finished my dessert. I was extremely pleasant to Alec and his fiancée when they came around to thank their guests, and then I told Brendan I was taking an Uber home, kissed him on the cheek, and left. He didn't follow me. That was also a moment. The next 2 weeks were strange. Brendan called the following morning, apologetic but vague. He was sorry the evening had been uncomfortable. He was sure his mother hadn't meant to upset me. He hoped we could move past it. I listened. I said I needed a few days to think. In those few days, I did something Brendan probably didn't expect. I started asking questions. I called a former colleague from my old job, a woman named Harriet, who had been there when I left and who I trusted completely. I asked her if she had ever heard of any complaint or issue related to my departure. She said, "Are you serious? You were the most organized person on that team. When you left, 2 clients asked if you were going somewhere they could follow you." I thanked her. I asked one more question. Did she know of Vincent? Slightly. She said he had done some contract work for the firm around the time I was leaving. She said he had applied for a position I'd been promoted into, and he didn't get it. There it was. I did a little more digging. Not a lot. Enough. I found out that Vincent had stayed in touch with Maureen through a mutual connection, one of Brendan's aunts who played golf with someone in Vincent's circle. I found out that, at some point, he had told this chain of people that my departure from the firm had been for the best and implied, without quite saying it, that there had been issues. What I could not find out, what I still don't know for certain, is whether Brendan knew any of this before that dinner. Whether he knew Vincent had said those things to his mother and said nothing to me about it. Whether he had known and decided it wasn't worth a conversation. I think about that a lot. I called Scott again. The Vincent piece, Harriet, the golf connection, all of it. He listened in that quiet accountant way he has, and then he said, "So it wasn't random. Someone built this." I said, "Yeah." He said, "What does Brendan say about it?" I said, "I haven't told him yet." Scott said, "Why not?" I said, "Because I want to see what he does when I do." I called Brendan that evening and I laid it all out. Vincent's failed application, the golf connection, the way the story had reached his mother, the fact that none of it was true and that verifying it had taken me about 3 phone calls and 2 days. Brendan was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I didn't know about Vincent." I said, "Okay." He said, "I mean it. I had no idea he'd said anything to anyone." I said, "But you knew your mother had concerns about me." Before the dinner. Another pause. Longer, he said. "She'd mentioned a few things," I said, "and you didn't think to tell me." He said, "I thought I could handle it." I said, "Handle what? Me? Or her?" He didn't answer that. There's a particular kind of grief that comes when you realize the person you love has been managing you, quietly, with good intentions maybe, but managing you nonetheless. Deciding what you need to know. Deciding what he could handle on your behalf without your knowledge or consent. It's not a dramatic grief. It doesn't announce itself. It just settles in your chest somewhere and stays there. I told Brendan I needed a week. He said, "Okay." I went to Ottawa and stayed with Scott and his wife for 5 days. I walked along the Rideau Canal in the cold and thought about the 3 years. I thought about all the Thanksgivings and the Christmases and the times Maureen had rearranged my dishes and the times Brendan had said, "She's just like that," and I had nodded. I thought about the dinner in Burlington and the moment Brendan looked at his plate. Scott's wife, who is a very sensible woman, and also my friend, asked me one evening what I wanted the next 5 years to look like. I said I wanted to feel like I wasn't auditioning. She said, "Then you have your answer." I came back to Oakville on a Sunday. Brendan drove to meet me. We sat in my apartment kitchen with tea that neither of us really drank, and I told him what I'd worked out in Ottawa. I told him that I loved him. I meant it completely, still do. I told him that 3 years was real and nothing about what happened changed what those 3 years were. And then I told him that I couldn't marry into a family where his mother felt entitled to publicly humiliate me, and where his response was to look at his plate, and where I would spend the rest of my life wondering what was being said about me in rooms I wasn't in. He said, "I'll talk to her." I said, "I know you believe that." He said, "I'll set boundaries. I'll make it clear." I said, "Brendan, you knew she had concerns about me, and you decided to manage it yourself without telling me. That was a choice. I'm not saying it was malicious, but it was a choice, and it tells me something about what the next 20 years would look like." He looked like I had taken something from him. I understood that. I felt like something was being taken from me too. We sat there for a while longer. He asked if there was anything that would change my mind. I said honestly, maybe if things were different, but they weren't different, and we couldn't rebuild on a foundation I wasn't sure about. He left around 9. I called Scott when the door closed. He didn't say, "I told you so," or "You did the right thing," or anything like that. He just stayed on the phone with me for a while, talking about nothing much, until I said I was going to try to sleep. A week later, I got a voicemail from Maureen. She said she wanted to apologize, that she had spoken with Brendan and understood she had misspoken at the dinner, that she hoped we could speak, that she had always wanted what was best for her son, that she hoped I would give their family another chance. I listened to it twice. I didn't call her back, not because I wanted to punish her, not because I was angry. I wasn't, really, not anymore. But because an apology that comes after a conversation with your son, when the engagement is already off and the damage is done, isn't really an apology to me. It's a phone call made for Brendan's sake, or for hers. And I had spent 3 years being patient on behalf of other people's feelings. I was done with that. Vincent, from what I heard secondhand through the old colleague network, eventually figured out that his story had unraveled. I don't know what happened to him professionally. I don't think about him much. A person who sabotages someone else's relationship because they didn't get a job promotion is living in a very small and unhappy world, and I find I don't have a lot of energy left over for that. Brendan and I have not spoken since that Sunday in my kitchen. I think about him sometimes, the small things he remembered, the steadiness I loved. I think about who he might have been if he'd looked up from that plate. I don't know. Maybe he's working on it. I hope he is. I still live in Oakville. I got a promotion of my own last March. Director of Project Management, which I mention not to brag, but because Harriet texted me about it and said, "See?" And I laughed for the first time in a while. My brother comes to visit every few months, and we walk the waterfront and argue about hockey in the way that only siblings can. I kept a few things from those 3 years. A good cast iron pan we'd picked out together, a road trip playlist I still listen to, the knowledge that I am capable of choosing myself when I need to. The night I called Scott from outside that restaurant in Burlington, standing in the November cold with snow about to fall, I didn't know what I was going to do. I only knew I couldn't go back to that table and pretend nothing had happened. That was enough. Sometimes that's all you need, just knowing you can't go back. The snow started on the drive home.